Welcome back to Mountain Bike Express, and we're rejoining the men's race halfway through lap 2 in the single track below the cliff. Nick had kept the pressure up and the group was constantly stretching out, with Chris and Gary having to work to stay in touch. But the elastic had snapped for Tim Davis, who just can't find his 92 form, and would shortly have David breathing down his neck as the rally rider continued in his move up the field, in what is becoming an almost weekly occurrence. As often has been the case, his teammate Adrian Timmis assisted him, but he also took a tumble at the cliff. Richard, though, was relishing all the technical sections as he maintained his top 10 position, having moved ahead of Paul Dixon, who was now slipping down the field and was soon to be passed by another good technical rider, Robin Seymour, though not everyone was finding the cliff so painless.
Oh, it's me again. I like this bit. Come on, mate. Whoa! Yeah.
Thank you.
In the wake of such mayhem came the women's leader Caroline Alexander, who was showing how much she had improved technically this year. But having done the difficult bit, she also showed how the slightest lack of concentration can be costly as she slid out on a tree route in the single track. But in a sport where tumbles are the norm, she was soon back up and pedalling, having lost only a few seconds of her 2.5-minute lead over Deb, who was having problems of her own. Deb's frustrations were not really directed at the tape, but more at herself, as she was beginning to tire and was now under pressure from Helen, who was only 20 seconds behind her and closing fast. For Caroline, this would be an empty victory, as she wasn't contesting the series. But when I spoke to her at the start of the season, her aims were clear.
Hopefully just improve on last year, really. I want to do more on the international scene and obviously retain my national championship title in August. Over the winter, I've worked on every aspect of my riding, from bike handling to strength and power, so hopefully I'll improve a little bit in every way.
Climbing up Maddox Coppice, and the inevitable had happened, as Helen moved up to second and was now pushing the pace to ensure that Deb couldn't get back on terms. But the Formula One rider was more concerned about staying clear of the riders behind her. In fourth, Sally Hibbard was again showing her return to form, and though 2 minutes down on Deb, she was looking far more comfortable, and there were still 2 laps to go. Sian, meanwhile, had moved up to fifth, which would be enough to give her the series. But as you can hear from her breathing, she too was suffering. Picking up the men's race halfway through the third lap, and again there were changes in the lead group. Nick was the unlucky one who had fallen away with a broken chain, while David had completed his recovery and attached himself to the rear of the group, where he was planning on taking a breather. In sixth, Tim had got a second wind that had kept him only 55 seconds off the pace. But unlike David, he couldn't close the gap as the leaders were taking it in turns to do the work. And a sight that cheered all the crowd was Tim Gould, who has been fighting a debilitating illness all season, returning to his more accustomed place at the head of the field, having finished as far down as 20th in the first race of the series. For the Alpine Stars rider, it was a matter of pacing himself and hoping that some others would slip out the back. While a strong third lap had seen Saracen's Peter Stevenson move up half a dozen places, and he was now only 35 seconds down on the Welshman. While also moving up, and now in 8th, was Proflex's Robin Seymour. He had gained a position at the expense of Adrian Timmis, who after working hard to help David, was now let down by his bike, and could only look at his gears in dismay as the young pair, Richard Thackeray and Paul Lazenby, pass him by. But the biggest R must go out to Nick, who fixed his chain only to have it snap again, and with it went his hopes for the series. midway through lap 4 and the lead group was holding together. But now Barry was prepared to go to the front and he seemed to be making Gary suffer as they turn onto the fire track. Gary and Tim's manager Simon Burney passes out water bottles, which are invaluable to the riders on such a warm, humid day. In the course of a 2.5-hour race, the riders will probably drink about 2 litres to replace lost body fluid. For Tim Davies, it's his father Mike who does the bottle job, and he was also no doubt informing Tim of the way Peter Stevenson was coming up behind him. Peter was putting in his best mountain bike ride of the season. He'd often been up there in the early stages, but usually faded near the end. And no doubt his manager and an old hand, Mick Ives, would be advising him on how best to survive this one. Heading down the cliff, and Barry was still setting the pace, while the crowd were beginning to sense a spectacular finish.
Yeah.
On the way up through Maddox Coppice, Gary became the 5th rider to give in to the speed of the group as he gradually slipped away on the climb, and the leaders were now really working. Gary was looking ragged and was moving his upper body a lot, which is a sure sign of fatigue. However, behind him, Tim was again beginning to struggle and didn't look capable of capitalising on a Scot rider's misfortune. The leaders were looking out for each other's weaknesses as they headed into the end of the lap, with David still sitting at the back and with only Chris to worry about in the group as Gary slipped nearly a minute off the pace. Picking up the women's race on their final lap, and as Caroline dropped down the cliff, she was completely unchallenged, having opened a lead of 4 minutes and 20 seconds over the New Zealander, who opted for a run down as she was tiring. The men were also taking no chances, as a slip by any one of them would probably put them out of contention. And third-place woman, Sally Hibbard, was grateful that she had a 20-second cushion over Sian Roberts as she struggled down. Sian was no longer worried as she had just passed Deb and knew that the series was hers. Heading into the finish arena, and Caroline was all smiles as she comfortably took the win in her first race back on home soil. And that will give her confidence for next week's national championships. Behind her, Helen took her second on the trot, which will ensure she gets a place in the New Zealand team for the World Championships. But the crowd were waiting for the men, and as Tim led up the climb, the group was whittled down to 3, with Chris having to watch the action from a distance, and David also struggling to prevent getting dropped. But he was now almost sure of the title. Once he knew he wouldn't contest first, Chris decided to settle down at his own pace, securing the knowledge that he was now 1 minute 45 seconds up on Gary, who had lost touch with the group at exactly the same place on the previous lap. Sally was about to collect points for second for the third race on the trot, and with Deb back in 5th, that meant she would also take second in the series. Not bad for a mum with a 1-year-old. Behind Tim, Peter Stevenson had done enough to secure 7th, and behind him was the new 7-up BMBF National Point Series winner, Pace's Sian Roberts. On the final climb, Tim and David had been busily watching each other, which allowed Barry to slip away for his second National Point Series win of the season, which also gave him second in the series, behind his teammate who got the better of Tim on the final descent, as the Schwinn rider had a slow puncture. But he undoubtedly got the biggest cheer of the day. Meanwhile, spare a thought for those who are suffering. Or so tired they were seeing double. Caroline, it seemed to be an easy race for you today at Shrewsbury.
Well, I'd hoped it would be that way, but you never know, and I felt a lot of pressure coming here today, because the last time I raced any of these girls was the Plymouth BMBF, and it's always easier when there's people that are better than you in the race, and I hoped that wasn't the case today.
I was really suffering today. I started the race with a lung infection. It's just a recurring thing. It's not infectious or anything. And I sort of was just having a great trouble breathing. So I sound terrible when I breathe in a race anyway, that's why. And it's just like today I was terrible. I could only breathe about half a lungful. So it was, I was struggling all the way around. I was just glad to get round really today.
It was a hard race today. It was a bit more tactical than most of the races. People like Chris Young kept dropping him and he kept getting back on, and then we went hard on a few hills, and the last lap David tried to get away on the very last hill and Tim was just with him, and I was say 2 or 3 yards off the pace. As I came down onto the last fire road, they were like sitting up watching each other, and I came round the corner and jumped them, and I got me lead, and that was it really.
It was quite hard though this year. Like I seem to have had more than my fair share of bad luck in every race really. So I'm quite pleased really that I've got through with it and won the series.
Here in Shrewsbury today you had more bad luck, didn't you?
Yeah.
You came off, didn't you?
Yeah, I came off early on in the first lap, but the crash didn't actually lose me any time. My cable pulled through for some strange reason, and I was only on the little ring for a while until I stopped and pulled the cable through again.
So Barry became the only rider to gain 2 wins in the series this year. And with Nick Craig failing to finish, that meant that Barry and Chris moved on to the podium behind the 93 series winner, David Baker. Caroline returns to the British race scene with a crushing victory that will have her rivals quaking before next week's national championships. But for now, Sian will be satisfied with a series title on her 6th attempt. And to the crowd's applause, the series winners took their places on the podium. Next week, they all go again for the big one, the 7-Up BMBF National Championships.